Tonight, a special interview with superstar psychologist and best-selling author Jordan Peterson at the start of a conference in London today with conservative celebrities to kick off a worldwide movement against fearmongers and big government. Don't miss our chat. We'll also talk about the war against Israel and a tweet he sent that he says was a mistake. But on that war, we'll cross to Israel for the latest as the tanks finally go into Gaza. Meanwhile, the pogroms have started with a Muslim mob hunting for Jews at a Russian airport and a sign at a Melbourne rally against Israel, warning Jews of a massacre to come. Also tonight, Qantas sits back in a $600 million case claiming it cheated customers. But first, Israel's invasion of Gaza has begun, and it's time to get some moral clarity in what's going on here. Its tanks went into the Palestinian enclave 3 weeks after the Hamas terrorist group that runs Gaza and is backed by Iran slaughtered 1,400 Israelis and took 230 hostage. Israel's Prime Minister addressed the nation.
Our partners in the Arab world believe and understand today that unless Israel wins, they will be next in line in this conquer and murder. This is our second war of liberation.
Now, that axis of evil is already threatening to turn this invasion into a wider war, even a world war. As Israel went in, rockets were fired at it from Lebanon, Yemen and Syria, all suspected from Iran-backed terrorists in those countries. Iran itself is threatening war. Russia last week hosted a Hamas delegation that asked it for help. Now, on the Israeli side, the US has sent 3 naval battle groups to help its air defences and warn off any country thinking of helping Hamas. But that is not the whole nightmare for Israel. It faces other horrific challenges, and many of its soldiers could die, as will Palestinian civilians. For one, the hostages that Hamas took are believed to be scattered in the 500 kilometres of tunnels Hamas says is built under Gaza, tunnels for its fighters and its weapons, and these tunnels will be booby-trapped. What's more, some of their entrances and rooms are believed to be under Gaza's main hospital, for instance. In fact, Hamas command headquarters are reportedly there. Others are under mosques, schools, apartment buildings, so clearing them out is going to be deadly work. And Hamas has made sure its civilians will die as human shields. In fact, it has banned many civilians from fleeing to somewhere safer. It has also not built them air raid shelters and won't let them hide in its tunnels either. And if you still doubt what is going on here, the Hamas leader asked his own civilians to die to give Hamas a propaganda win.
كما قلت وفي كل مرة أكرر إن دماء الأطفال والنساء والشيوخ لا أقول تستصرخكم بل نحن الذين نحتاج هذه الدماء لكي توقظ فينا روح الثورة.
How long before Israel's critics finally realise Hamas really is a death cult and there can be no peace with a group like that? Now, Israel has a further problem as well, international pressure to actually give in. In the United Nations, you hear what many on the left here are saying too: ceasefire. When a ceasefire actually means leave Hamas alone even when it slaughters your people. Never, Israel, fight back. On the weekend, the UN even passed a resolution calling for that ceasefire. Only 14 countries voted against it. Countries like the US, because this resolution didn't also criticise Hamas or call on Hamas to release its hostages. Now, sadly, our Albanese government was not one of those 14. It just abstained. Opposition leader Peter Dutton and former Liberal Foreign Minister Alexander Downer were scathing.
And I think it was an incredibly weak display of leadership from the Prime Minister.
I definitely think Australia should have voted against it because, after all, a truce, some sort of halt in the action against Hamas, that's what people are really demanding, will give Hamas the opportunity to resupply.
But the United Nations did worse than that. Countries like China and Russia also voted down another resolution which did condemn Hamas, the terrorist group that actually started this war, and applauded as they did so.
Draft Amendment A/ES10 L26 is not adopted.
Now, in Israel, at least in Australia, 6 of our 7 former Prime Ministers, from John Howard to Scott Morrison, including Julia Gillard, at least signed a statement calling out what's going on. They're blaming Hamas for causing this war and pointing to rising anti-Semitism in this country. But the 7th surviving ex-Prime Minister, Paul Keating, refused to sign. Well, he's fanatically pro-China, in my opinion, and almost crazily anti-American. Is that something to do with it? I don't know. And in our streets, the same division. In Melbourne, a pro-Palestinian group whose leader has called for Israel to be destroyed from the river to the sea actually got permission to fly 7 Palestinian flags. And in Sydney, the Canterbury Bankstown Council, heavily Muslim area, flew their own Palestinian flag, backed by Federal Labor Minister Tony Burke.
Once again, it is not the Hamas flag that's flying, it's the Palestinian flag. And it's a flag that gives people the chance to know that there is recognition and not selective grief.
Well, I have news for Burke. That flag still is a battle flag of another terrorist group. It was adopted by the Palestinian Liberation Army or organisation when terrorist Yasser Arafat was its leader. And behind that history is a truth. Israel is in a war for its survival against the terrorist group backed by regimes who hate the West and its freedoms as well. This is a war we cannot afford Israel to lose. Now, I've got to say, as a PS, I've said this war against Israel, launched by the Hamas terrorist group, is part of something hugely dangerous. I've said there is an axis of evil now, of authoritarian regimes coming together, Russia, China, North Korea and Iran, which funds Hamas. Well, that's now confirmed by Khalid Mashal, who's the former head of Hamas and still a leader there, who has actually met Russian President Putin, for instance. Now, note this really well. I know a lot of people don't like the subtitles and all that kind of stuff, but you've got to know this. It's dynamite, the big plan unveiled.
ونريد حراك في الجاليات الغربية والعربية في الغرب وتنسيق مع قوة كبرى بحجم الصين وروسيا. لمعلوماتك روسيا استفادت مما لأنه صرفنا الأمريكان عنهم وعن أوكرانيا. الصين كذلك رأوا نموذج مبهر. الروس قالون ما جرى في 7 أكتوبر سيدرس في العلم العسكرية. الصينيون يفكرون بخطوة كيف يفعلون مع تايوان ما فعلته كتائب القسام 7 أكتوبر.
Well, after the break, the Prime Minister was on a hello, goodbye trip to Australia. He's off again on Saturday, you see, this time to China. It's just offended all this flying around, but is he losing focus? The panel after this, and then Jordan Peterson talking about a new worldwide movement that he's helping to start in London today to try and get control back over our lives after this. This war does show the old hatred of Jews actually never died, is now unleashed. In Russia, in the largely Muslim region of Dagestan, there's now even been a pogrom. A crowd stormed the airport looking for Jews, even on the tarmac, when they heard a plane from Tel Aviv had landed. 20 people were injured, 2 critically, as they even checked the papers of the passengers. In London, meanwhile, another mass demonstration by Muslims against Israel, with some flying the black flag of jihad. There was also flying of that black flag in another big protest in Germany. In the US, Jewish students at the prestigious Cornell University had to be locked down after multiple threats to kill and rape them. In Melbourne, protesters held up this anti-Semitic sign, "Please keep the world clean," by putting Israel in the bin. And this one, Israel, recall Khaybar, history will repeat. That's a reference to how the Islamic prophet Muhammad slaughtered a Jewish tribe. There is a great sickness afoot. Joining me now from Israel on the latest on the war is Ariel Oziran, as a former analyst with the Israeli Intelligence Corps and now a Middle East correspondent with I24 News. Ariel, thank you so much for joining us. What is happening now on the ground, or at least that we know of?
Well, Andrew, that depends on where you're asking. First of all, thank you for having me. Israel is engaged in a multi-front campaign right now. It's officially at war, and its ground troops have been operating inside Gaza. I mean, there were for weeks the question whether the ground invasion will begin, when will it begin? So slowly, gradually, and quietly, I must add, the ground invasion of Gaza has begun. Israeli forces are advancing slowly in the northern part of the Gaza Strip, and they're encountering terrorists, taking out hundreds of Hamas targets. That's according to the latest update by the IDF. On the northern border, there has been exchanges of fire between Israeli forces and Hezbollah terrorists, as well as other Palestinian organizations, pretty much since October 7th, since day one. Yesterday, there was intensification of the cross-border fighting. This includes anti-tank guided missile attacks on military outposts, military vehicles, as well as rockets on northern Israeli cities. All the while, also in the south, rockets continue to be launched nonstop towards southern Israeli communities. Every once in a while, there's a siren in central Israel as well, in Tel Aviv, and millions of people have to go into the shelters. And those are the two main fronts. But if you add to that the flare-up in the West Bank with hundreds of arrests and clashes every night, you have Yemen. Yemen launched drones and cruise missiles at Israel that were taken down by American forces. And also you cannot ignore the fact that as the U.S. has brought forces here to the region, some of them already engaging with Iranian proxies, like I just mentioned, the Houthis. U.S. bases in Iraq and in Syria have been struck at least 20 times since October 7th by pro-Iranian militia. So as you can see, you have a wide array of different areas, different fronts that Israel is engaged in, but obviously the main front is the southern front and potentially the northern front as well.
Well, the strategy seems to be establishing a sort of bridgehead in northern Gaza and moving gradually in. It's not a whole storming of the city. The difficulty remains the hostages. Any word about them?
Indeed, 239 hostages. That's the latest count, which has only been rising, even with the release of three elderly and one young woman hostages since October 7th. This is a sore subject for Israelis because on the one hand, they want to advance with this ground operation. They want to get the job done. They want to topple Hamas. On the other hand, there are over 230 Israelis being held hidden inside Hamas underground tunnels in various spots across the Gaza Strip. I mean, family members who their loved ones were kidnapped. So on the first day that they were kidnapped, they could locate their phone inside the Gaza Strip, but that's the last they heard of them. Yeah. There's a lot of international mediation.
Yeah, there's a lot of international mediation, but Hamas is not going to let them go. That's their one bargaining chip, and they're going to play it for all it's worth. And it's a choice: go in or save the hostages. I don't know that you can do both, much as I hate to say that. Ariel Ozeran, thank you so much for your update. Really appreciate it. Honestly, it is terrible. But I tell you what, the Prime Minister, right, is back in a flying visit to Australia in between going to America, then to China on Saturday. So his polling must be telling him something about Australia because he's just defended it in the media. He says it's part of the job, that international engagement representing Australia. There's been no international visits for the sake of it. They've all been hard work. I don't doubt that. But joining me is the panel, Michael Kroger, former President of the Victorian Liberals, and Steve Conroy, former Labor Senator and Cabinet Minister. Michael, I am not a critic of Prime Ministers going out and selling Australia, making deals with other leaders. That's the job. I know that. But I just wonder whether he's losing focus and focusing on the right things with these trips.
Well, I think he is. I'm not a critic of Albanese's overseas travel. I think it's very important for Australia to fly the international flag, given the great country we are. We're not a small country in terms of our international weight. So I think it's important for him to go to America to see the president. He's going to see the president of China. They're the two biggest names in the world, two biggest, most important countries in the world. So I think it's good that he does that. But of course, he has lost huge focus because of the voice, and this is what everyone's complaining about.
Israel?
Well, of course, he should have gone to Israel on the way there or the way back. That's my only criticism of him. He should have gone to Israel. But there's still time for that, and I certainly hope he goes.
But meanwhile, something that we might have been able to land, the trade deal with the European Union, it's collapsed. Now, the Europeans obviously don't want to open their markets to our farmers, but I just wonder whether the Prime Minister could personally have intervened a little more on that.
Well, look, trade negotiations with the EU have long been fraught. We can all make jokes about all of the, the wine lakes and all of the protectionism that the French engage in their farmers and militants. They block. So the French very rarely negotiate. A deal that is not to their absolute maximum. Look, I'd like to believe that it could be done, but I think there is a point where you just have to stand back and say, well, it's not going to happen because the concessions they want from you and the lack of concessions they're prepared to give just make the deal not add up.
I'm just not seeing some of the benefits coming through. I mean, here's another thing. The world's dangerously close to World War III. We still haven't got, even on this trip to America, the American Congress, which has been an absolute shambles, agree to pass on the technology that will allow us to buy American submarines, nuclear submarines, that we desperately need. We still haven't got that. And meanwhile, the former Foreign Minister, Alexander Downer, warns that the idea that we're going to build more of these subs in Adelaide is a joke. Here he is.
Getting the nuclear submarines is important to national and more broadly regional security, so I'm in favour of that. But building them in Australia is way too expensive and it will never happen.
It's not going to happen. When is the decision going to be made? It's not an employment program.
No.
It's the defence of the nation.
And that was a criticism that we got under the previous administration.
Correctly.
Because of Adelaide. I don't know when a decision is going to be made. No one knows Adelaide better than Alexander, and the first subs are not due for 20 years. So are they going to be built in Australia? Probably not, Andrew.
Then it's got to be said, doesn't it? It's got to be said now. Don't kick this problem 5 years down the road.
Well, you've got to have two options. I mean, you've just made the point that the American Congress is a shambles. You can look at the reports that are coming out of the US that say the Americans aren't able to give us two in the short term. And the deal was always if we weren't able to progress as far or as fast with our builds, then we could get up to 6. But the evidence that the American Congress is looking at is their own their submarine building program is a mess, and they may not be willing to give it to us. So we have to have both options on the table, and both options need to be pursued hard.
Well, there's a third, of course, is spending more money on helping the Americans build them there.
Well, that is part of the deal. But part of the deal is that we are giving them some money.
Something, yes, but maybe more. The government's handling the Middle East crisis, meanwhile, another issue that they've lost focus here. They're sending mixed messages, trying to speak out of both corners of their mouths. We've got Jew hatred running nuts, and no one is really quite sure where the government stands on this war.
It's certainly not the government of Bob Hawke in relation to Israel. That's obvious. But Andrew, let me say this to you. In all the hundreds of interviews and the thousands of hours of TV that we've watched, in all those interviews that I've seen of all the Palestinian leaders around the world, there's one question that's never, ever been asked, which is this, to Tony Burke or to Arn Ali or to anybody who's supporting the Palestinian cause. Do you think Hamas should surrender? Do you think Hamas should surrender? Because I've never heard anyone say yes, and if they say, yes, but they'll never do it, I've never heard anyone at a pro-Palestinian rally say Hamas should surrender, stop Hamas, Hamas mass murderers. I've never heard anyone amongst the many Muslim countries in the Middle East who support the Palestinian cause, I've never heard any of them call on Hamas to surrender. Hamas, we're told, don't represent the Palestinian people in Gaza or the West Bank. So if it only represents 30,000 people, and the last election was in 2006, why isn't the worldwide debate about this rogue terrorist organisation that represents nobody, that nobody supports? Why isn't the world focused on why haven't Hamas leadership surrendered like Hitler did? Because they represent nobody, and for the focus to be on Israel, and for the Western media, so Hamas here, Israel here, one's a democracy, one's a terrorist organisation.
Yeah, well, don't know that they don't represent a lot of Palestinians. I wish I did believe it.
Look, I mean, the Prime Minister was asked in the US, you know, whose side you're on. He said, I'm against Hamas. I don't think you can be much clearer than that. I'm against Hamas. I share some of Michael's frustrations that Hamas, you know, a registered terrorist organisation, and Hamas made a unilateral attack in an attempt to provoke a war, in an attempt to try and get Israel to engage in the land invasion, where they know they will hide behind hospitals, they will hide behind whatever schools are left open, they will hide behind civilians, and they will seek to cause Israel to kill innocent civilians because of their tactics.
Yeah,
and that is their strategy.
Then you get people like Tony Burke muddling the message, and people like that. I'm in despair a little bit, I've got to say. Steve Conroy, Michael Kroger, thank you both so much for your time. After the break, Jordan Peterson on a new international crusade starting in London today to get us to take responsibility and fight back against the alarmists who are stealing your freedom. He's also sorry about what he says is a mistake he made about Israel. I'm not so sure after this. We have so many fearmongers now, you know, global warming, the pandemic, people using fear to argue for more control over your lives. Well, today in London, there's the start of what's hopefully a worldwide movement to fight back, to fight for reason, optimism, personal responsibility and less government bullying. It's called the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship. It's a brainchild of best-selling author and psychologist Jordan Peterson. Australia's former Deputy Prime Minister John Anderson and Baroness Philippa Stroud, who formerly ran another think tank, are also behind it. And today is the start of their first international conference, 1,500 people there. It's big. Now, from Australia, you've got Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price, John Howard, Tony Abbott, Amanda Stoker, Barnaby Joyce, Andrew Hayes, and others. And from the US, the Republicans' new Speaker of the House of Representatives, for instance, Republican presidential hopeful Vivek Ramaswamy. And from Britain, former ministers, present ministers as well. Also sensible environmentalists, Bjorn Lomborg, Michael Schellenberger. So it's big. Joining me earlier is the man who thought of it. As I said, Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson, thank you so much for joining me. This Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, great speakers, sold out, your idea. What did you want it to achieve?
Well, I would like it to achieve a new motivation for people, I suppose. It's not precisely a political conference. I would characterize it as a motivational conference, and that makes sense with regard to my involvement because I'm a psychologist and not a politician. And my sense of the world is that we are allowing ourselves to lose faith and courage and to accept an apocalyptic and limited view of the future and all of the tyrannical restrictions that are likely to accompany that because we're afraid. And I can understand why people are afraid. There's always reason to be afraid of the future because we're vulnerable and terrible things can happen to each of us and will and to our societies. But I think that courage and faith, wide-eye open courage and faith when confronting the future is the most appropriate stance.
Well, just to introduce the conference, you and another speaker, Bjorn Lomborg, who's been a regular guest here too, you co-wrote an op-ed saying among this catastrophizing you just talked about, well, look, even now that we've got two wars going now in the Middle East as well as Ukraine, in fact, the death rate from war last year was not much more than a tenth of the rate of deaths by war last century. Deaths from climate disasters, only a tiny fraction of what it was 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago. We're richer. So why do you think there is this catastrophizing now?
And I think that it's easier for bad news to sell, and in a marketplace where legacy media sources in particular, and perhaps everyone else, are desperate for clicks, it's easier to attract people's attention to the negative than it is to attract their attention to the positive. It's also easy if you're no longer naive and you say move from naive to cynical, which is a step towards wisdom, to assume that a clear-headed person would take a dire view of the future with all the terrible things that might make themselves manifest. But I think there's a step past that bitter cynicism to a courageous optimism, and I don't think that that story has been told very well. I don't think that political leaders have been able to develop, regardless of their position on the political spectrum, have been able to develop anything approximating a positive vision that people find compelling and attractive. And I guess the other thing that we're trying to offer to people as a potential positive vision is the notion that if each person took responsibility for their lives, we haven't had serious discussion of responsibility in our culture for about 6 decades. If each person took the requisite responsibility that could be part and parcel of their lives, they would find something useful and interesting and adventurous and compelling to do, and they wouldn't put themselves in a position where they were likely to fall sway to the blandishments of utopian centralizing globalists. One of the things we're really striving to do with this organization is to try to communicate to people the fact that the alternative to the top-down centralizing totalitarian globalist vision isn't another vision of that sort. It's more the dissemination of the idea that each person has a very important role to play in bringing about a positive future, and the attempt to offer encouragement to people and recognition to them if they're actually doing that. And, you know, I've been very heartened by this as I've toured around the world, because I've been talking about the relationship between responsibility and meaning to my audiences and in my books for quite a long time. And it isn't part of our culture anymore that we don't do a good job of communicating the fact that the meaning that will sustain you in your life, especially through the difficult times, is to be found in the adoption of the fullest responsibility you can manage, and that's simultaneously the adventure of your life, and that if you do take all that on, then there's no reason for you to be a slave to the vision of someone or multiple someones who might want to control your destiny, you know, the destiny that you've abandoned.
The thing is, you might have to talk down my own sense of alarm, because while I totally agree with you about the climate crisis, the exaggeration of it, the so-called climate crisis, and the fact we are getting richer, the fact the world has been more peaceful than historically, what does alarm me is the trashing of Western society that's produced all that. There seems to be a concerted attack on Western civilization, on its history, on its freedoms, instead of any appreciation for it. And without appreciation for it, you're not going to defend it.
Yeah, well, you expose the nakedness of your ancestors, so to speak, at your own peril. Right? We like to parade around our comparative virtue in the West because that's an easy way of appearing moral, and we do that by proclaiming as loudly as we possibly can that we're better in every way that can possibly be imagined than everyone who came before us. And there's a tremendous and desperate ingratitude in that, and it is very dangerous. It's not surprising that you would be alarmed by that. I think it is very alarming. It's easy for ungrateful people to take what they have for granted, and we would be fools in the West to take what we have for granted, because it's a bloody miracle that, for me, as far as I'm concerned, it's always a bloody miracle that there aren't constant, terrible riots in the street and everything in flames, you know, and we've had things comparatively good enough for long enough so that we've forgotten just how awful things can be. But I don't think that means that the situation is hopeless by any stretch of the imagination, because the other thing that I have observed, again in my lectures and as a consequence of the effect I've seen of the information that I've been relaying to people, is that you can remind people what's noble and virtuous about the culture that they exist in, while still being completely clear-headed and open-eyed about the catastrophes of the past and the present, and that you can invite people back to the to the noble adventure of the West, let's say, and people respond very positively to that, especially if you can break it down to the point where they can determine how to implement positive changes in their own life. And that's, I suppose, the psychological component of this. And so I don't think that the situation is desperate, although it's dire. We're in a strange time because we have more opportunity in front of us and more potential for catastrophe than we have had at any point in the past. And the reason for that is that we're much more technologically powerful and that things are transforming at a much more rapid rate than they ever have. And so that means that we could all go to hell in a handbasket in a particularly spectacular way, and we could create a deeper hell than any we've ever managed to produce in the past, which is really saying something. But I would say, by the same token, we could produce a world that's much better than anything we could have ever dreamed of, and that's an equally likely outcome, assuming that that's what we decided to aim for. And so, and I also think that things are changing fast enough now, so we will see the consequences of that decision play out in the lifetime, in the near lifetime of people over the next few decades. Now, you might say, well, which of those two likelihoods is most likely to make itself manifest, the hell we could produce or the comparative, promised land of abundance and opportunity? And I would say that depends, and I really mean this and believe it, that depends on the decision of every single person who's currently alive. If we all aim up and we do what's necessary to make aiming up a reality, then we have an unlimited horizon in front of us. But if we are foolish and frightened and tyrannical and narcissistic and ungrateful and sinful, for that matter, then we could make things pretty damn miserable, and we could do it fast.
Seems we've swung from a love of freedom to a fear of it. There's a fear of free speech, for instance, a fear of individualism. Instead, we're now getting a new tribalism, new identity politics, race politics, censorship. You're being an attempt to censor you by the organisation representing psychiatrists in Canada, for instance, now. Increasing fear of freedom. Is that how you see it?
Well, it's a real dichotomy, isn't it? Because although my clinical license, for example, is under threat in Canada, the threat is illusory as well as real, because there isn't really anything the board of psychologists, the governing board of psychologists, can do to me that's going to stop me. And at the same time that my freedom to speak is curtailed, or attempts have been made to curtail it, I also have a platform of communication that's unparalleled in history. I don't mean me personally, I mean all of us, because we can communicate the way we're communicating right now across the world, and we can communicate with millions of other people. And so it's another reflection of this same dichotomy that's at least partly produced by accelerating technology, is that there are rapidly moving threats to freedom. We could easily turn into a surveillance state that would put what's being done in China to shame, where absolutely everything we did, every breath we take, would be monitored and controlled. And we have the technology to make that possible, and I think that's a real threat. Now, that doesn't mean it's inevitable. I think that people can decide that that's not the pathway that they want to walk down. Now, one relatively recent occurrence that might make you optimistic in a perverse manner is the fact that we did transform ourselves in the West into a totalitarian state for about 2 years. And we did that because we mimicked China, which was a very bad idea. And we did that because of the hypothetical threat of COVID, which was obviously massively overblown, but we rolled it back. And so what I would say about that is that it demonstrated that when push came to shove, people decided in favor of freedom and against restrictions, and that prevailed. And I see no reason why we couldn't continue to make the proper decisions as we move forward. Now, one of the things I've tried to do as I've toured around the world and written is also to inform people that the idea that we should pursue security and safety at the cost of freedom is an illusion, because I don't think there is any security and safety in life apart from what you might garner around yourself if you lived an honest and productive life. I think that we need to be more forthright, especially with young people, about the fact that life is an apocalyptic risk and always has been, but that the right attitude towards that isn't to hide yourself under your bed and cower and be triggered by every little occurrence that might upset you emotionally, but to face the world with some voluntary courage and find out as a consequence of doing that that there's a lot more to you than you think. And this is certainly something therapists have discovered, real therapists, in the last 100 years, because we know perfectly well, and every therapist worth his or her salt knows this, that if you help people confront what they're afraid of and intimidated by programmatically and strategically and voluntarily, they get much braver and more competent. And that's the right pathway forward. And if you explain that to young people, I would say, and to older people for that matter, they're pretty damn excited about that possibility, because we're built for adventure and not for security. And if you can tell the right story of adventure, then it overwhelms the attractiveness of the story of security or the story of hedonistic gratification.
Well, golly, I think that message very much needs to be heard now, because what makes me worried more is at the same time that freedom is being under assault internally in the West, the censorship, etc., we see powerful countries that are authoritarian coming together in an alliance to challenge the West. You've got China, you've got Russia, Iran and North Korea. I mean, just last week, the Hamas terrorist group that attacked Israel sent a delegation to talk to Russia. Iran sent a delegation there too. You see them coming together. And meanwhile, in the West, you see protesters supporting the Hamas war on Israel. You had I don't know how many were in London as you're gathering together for this conference, 100,000 or something, crowding the London Bridge, etc. It's just frightening. Protesting, there's protests too against saving Ukraine from the Russian invasion.
Yeah.
It just seems to be a weak commitment to freedom inside the West, just when it's being threatened by countries that are enemies of freedom.
Well, what we're seeing play out to some degree is the continued manifestation of the oppressor-oppressed narrative that's so characteristic of the totalitarian left. And in its latest guise, the Palestinians are playing the role of the unjustly oppressed. And once you accept that story, well, it's easy to get your back up about it, and there are reasons for that. But, I would say at the same time, a lot of the pretensions of the authoritarian left have been stripped away in the last month. Institutions like Harvard have taken what might be permanent stains on their reputation as a consequence of being a little bit too ideological in their approach. And then I would also say, you could also view the current conflict that's emerging in the Middle East as the last gasp of the totalitarian dictators, even in the Islamic world, because my sense is that, and I believe this to be the case, that Iran fueling Hamas did that out of desperation because they know that peace is about to break through with the Abraham Accords. And it isn't obvious to me that the countries that signed the Abraham Accords, making peace with Israel, are going to retreat from that, even in the face of these large-scale public demonstrations. I don't think Iran is going to be successful in its attempts to manipulate the Arab world back into permanent enmity with the Jews in Israel and with the Western world. Now, who knows, right? Because it's a dynamic and fluid situation, but I don't think there's any reason for despair. This could well be the last gasp of the brutal dictators. I'm not overwhelmingly naively optimistic about that, but the Abraham Accords were a major step forward, and they're not dead yet. And so I'm hoping that countries like the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, the Saudi Arabia who would have signed the Abraham Accords if they would have been approached properly, let's say by the Biden administration 2 years ago, I think they may still be on board. I think that's possibly still salvageable. And so there's room for hope even on that side of the equation.
That is true. The United Arab Emirates sent out a very reassuring message of condemnation of the Hamas attacks on Israel. But you yourself were abused in a pack attack online for tweeting just after that sadistic Hamas slaughter of 1,400 Jews 3 weeks ago. Give him hell, Netanyahu. Do you regret that? I mean, should you regret it?
Well, what I Twitter isn't a very good medium for commenting about vital matters, you know, and what I did in the aftermath of that was release a video explaining something like we talked about tonight, which was the relationship between the thugs in Iran and the support for Hamas and what's really going on behind the scenes. And, you know, that was a much more intelligent approach to the problem than my more emotional response to the Hamas brutality that unfolded in Israel. And so it's difficult to master these complex technologies of mass communication perfectly. And one of the things that I've been trying to learn is when a quick quip is appropriate and when something more thoughtful and longer form is appropriate. And in this particular situation, the longer form response was more appropriate. Do I regret it? Well, it's hard not to react with a certain degree of emotion when you see that kind of brutality reemerge. And I knew what was going on behind the scenes. I knew perfectly well that this was the death rattle of the Iranian state, or at least that's one way of looking at it. And the fact that they provoked their Hamas bullies into this brutal attack on Israel, they did it perfect. It was quite brilliant in many ways. The idea was, well, we'll have our Hamas lackeys do something so brutal that the Israelis will have to respond in kind, and given their likely military supremacy in relationship to the Hamas forces, tide will turn against the Israelis as they start to become successful. That'll divide the Arab world and scuttle the Abraham Accords. It's a pretty brilliant move, but it's a terrible thing to do in every way. I mean, I don't believe that the Arab world is properly oriented towards its own citizenry, the Islamic world, if the mullahs of Iran are their model of governance. I mean, even the people in Iran don't seem to think very highly of their totalitarian leaders. And so it isn't obvious to me that they're going to get away with this. Now, did I help or hurt that? Well, I don't know. I think that what I did was regarded to some degree as a betrayal by some of the Muslim people who had been following my work with some regard online, and that's unfortunate. And perhaps I could have handled that better, no doubt. But you know, when a situation is complex enough to cause a war, it's often going to be the case that commenting on it is a dangerous business. So, c'est la vie.
So when you're faced with, when evil betrays itself, unveils itself like this, I think it's quite understandable to, in a moment of clarity, I think by them, if you meant Hamas, give them hell, I don't know how you could want to row back from that. I mean, it's like confronting Auschwitz and not wanting to give the Nazi, you know, the people responsible hell. Of course you do. I mean, some people misinterpreted, I think, what you said to a general, give Palestinians hell. I don't know that's fair at all. Jordan Peterson, I'm tremendously excited by what you've started here in this London conference, and I hope it does morph into something bigger, because we do need more champions for these values that have built the West. Thank you so much indeed for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for the invitation.
And the full version of my interview with Dr. Jordan Peterson is on our website, skynews.com.au. It's on there right now. After the break, Qantas has had enough of saying sorry, and it's fighting back against claims it cheated customers in a case that could cost it $600 million. After this. Qantas today hit back at claims it cheated thousands of customers. Now, there's been the most amazing pile on Qantas, as you know, and on its now former boss, Alan Joyce. Now, one of the most damaging accusations has been from the ACCC competition watchdog, which wants Qantas hit with a $600 million fine for selling 8,000 tickets on flights last year that had already cancelled. Well, today Qantas, which has been saying sorry for a long time, now filed its defence, saying, well, the ACCC didn't understand the pressures it was under back then with these massive upheavals coming out of the COVID lockdown. And it says its tickets were explicit. Qantas wasn't selling a promise, to fly you on the one flight at that exact time, it was selling a bundle of rights, a promise to do its best to get customers to where they wanted to be on time. And that might mean alternative flights. I didn't know that, but there you go. Joining me is the country's top finance writer, Terry McCran of the Herald Sun. Strong defence?
Very strong defence, Andrew. I mean, there are two big points about all this. The ACCC somehow got it into its head that they've got a gotcha. They found that Qantas was doing what the banks were doing when they had those fees for no service. You know, they were charging dead people. They were charging them, they weren't actually providing any service. Qantas is selling tickets on planes that didn't exist, so-called ghost planes. The problem with the ACCC accusation is that, Qantas didn't set out to think, we can rip off these customers, we can sell them flights, they turn up at the airport, sorry, there's no plane, you've lost your money. It was all about coming out of COVID, and then getting hit by Omicron when you suddenly had these massive loss of flight crews. And when a flight crew doesn't turn up for work, Andrew, because of COVID, and they've got a quarantine, it's a little bit different to somebody not turning up to work in a cafe or a restaurant. You can't just immediately get another flight crew on that plane. So a lot of flights were cancelled and were going to be cancelled, and Qantas knew that. But the bottom line is there aren't any victims. As Qantas explained in the release, 100% of those caught in this flying domestically were offered a flight which either left before the flight they were booked on or within an hour of the flight they were booked on, or if that wasn't satisfactory, they got a full refund. Not as good on international.
Yeah, but that is a sort of victim. Well, what about the issue that the flights had
They got their flights. Well, because Qantas had a choice. Given the reality of COVID and the massive disruption and the loss of flight crews and crews across the board, and not just flight crews, they had a choice. They could just cut half their flights and make people scramble to find seats on flights, and not know just how many planes they're going to have available and how many crews they're going to have available, or keep all its scheduled flights flying, and when push came to shove, not on the day, we're not talking about on the day, this is counting down to the day, when it had a better sense of what flights had to be cancelled, then it could deal with those bookings. So it was trying to do the right thing by its customers, ultimately.
Well, what you say is a little bit better than what Virgin did to me the other day when in Darwin, they cancelled my flight home within a couple of hours' notice and come back tomorrow. For goodness sake. The Albanese government has had to give up making a trade deal with the European Union. Europe just wasn't going to open its markets. Is that a big blow? Was it ever on the cards?
No, because it wasn't ever on the cards, Andrew, the bottom line. I mean, what we want from the Europeans is to open their doors to our agricultural exports. They're not going to buy tons and tons of coal. They're closing down their coal-fired power stations. They don't want to buy tons and tons of iron ore. They don't have a steel industry much anymore.
So why was it
they want our ag exports. They we want them to buy our ag exports. But they've got their own farmers to protect. The Dutch put them aside, Andrew. They're not protecting their farmers. But the French desperately want to protect their farmers. And so the idea that they were going to open the doors to our ag exports was always a pipe dream.
So why were they selling it so hard? I don't quite get it.
Very silly.
Yeah, I thought it was stupid, rising expectations. The war in Ukraine caused devastation here, right? Fuel prices, gas prices, electricity prices, food prices. The war now in the Middle East, in Israel, it could broaden. I suspect maybe not, but we could. How is that going to affect us?
Well, it's uncallable, Andrew, obviously. I mean, I don't think the rosy scenario is the one that you should embrace, i.e., we wake up one day, the war's over, there's no threat to oil supplies, Iran, Iraq, even Saudi Arabia don't cut their oil production to try and put pressure on the West and in particular the US to force Israel to back off. So I don't see that rosy scenario coming anytime soon and quickly. If that's not going to happen, you really don't know how the reality is going to play out in terms of how the war itself goes and what the reaction of the Arab states, the Arab OPEC states are.
I tell you what, if they do get involved, and so far I think Israel is in better odour with some of those states like Saudi Arabia than people are giving it credit for, and the United Arab Emirates. But if it does go sour, it is going to hurt. But I've got fingers crossed. Terry McCran, thank you so much indeed for your time. That's it from me. Steve Price coming up next with Chris Kenny. Steve, take it away.